I was interested in Gandhi because my Cornelia Sorabji, who was my aunt, was quite opposed to Gandhi and had an interview with him in which she criticized him about violence, that though he was non-violent, he should take responsibility for his followers who had attacked some of her women clients. She was looking after the rights of Indian women, and she objected to violence used against her own clients to raise money. But I felt great admiration for Gandhi, and in a way this book is making amends. First I wrote a book about Cornelia Sorabji and her work for Indian women, but then I wanted to make amends by saying what I admired in Gandhi, and what was unusual was that I thought Gandhi was very good at philosophy, a model for philosophers. Not that he would have thought of himself that way at all. And I thought that he was very like some of the ancient Greek philosophers, which he would have recognized in one case. In the case of Plato, he loved Plato. He paraphrased one of Plato's works in Gujarati. It was Socrates on trial for his life. That was the subject of Plato's work. And Socrates is saying why he's not going to apologize for his life. He believes in what he did. He's ready to go to prison. He's ready to be executed. And this was paraphrased in Gujarati as Socrates the Satyagrahi. Socrates the Satyagrahi, he saw him as the very thing that he himself believed in, a Satyagrahi. But with the Stoics it was different. He only discovered the Stoics quite late in life, in 1924, when he was in prison. And so he thought, these are wonderful philosophers. I really do agree with them. And he was right to think that they had a great deal in common. But he found it so late in life that it didn't influence him in the same way. In a way, however, he was closer to the Stoics than to Plato. Because when he was influenced by something, he always changed it. He took some of it, he combined it with something he'd learned elsewhere, and he produced something of his own that was quite different. He didn't do that with the Stoics. Because he learned about them quite late in life, he left them as they were. And so his view finishes up closer to Stoicism, about which he didn't write, than to Platonism, or to Christianity, or to Christian authors like Tolstoy and Ruskin, about whom he did write. And I was trying to bring out the similarities with the Stoics in particular, though also, of course, with Christian writers, or also with Plato, also with the Bhagavad Gita and Indian sources. Yes, he read so widely, he had many sources, but he turned them into something very much of his own. It finished up not looking very much like Platonism, not looking very much like Christianity, although there are strong elements of Christianity, strong elements of Platonism, and of Tolstoy, and of Ruskin. But he went beyond them, so it was entirely original. I think originality doesn't mean you don't have sources. It's what you do with the sources, and the product he made was original. Well, Gandhi is famous, and rightly so, for believing in non-violence. But he thought that there was only one invariable rule about violence. On the whole, there was no invariable rule about whether to be violent or whether to be non-violent. There was one rule which had no exception whatsoever. Violence is always wrong. But it doesn't follow that you should never be violent. It doesn't follow, because it might be in a certain situation, suppose there's no other way of protecting somebody who's being attacked by a mob other than assaulting the attacker, it might be that though violence against the attacker is definitely wrong, there's no exception to that, it would be even more wrong just to allow the innocent victim to be killed. That's just one of many, many examples. And this is a subtle insight which only some philosophers in the West have had, that sometimes you are in a moral double bind, so that whether you do something violent, say, or whether you do practice non-violence, you'll be wrong in either case, but you've got to think now which is worse. If non-violence is worse in this case, it may be better to be violent. That's one reason why he sometimes advocated violence in particular cases. Here's another thought he had, a brilliant thought as it seems to me. He said, we are such imperfect beings that we are not able always to be non-violent. Why then recommend non-violence? Because it's better to have a counsel of perfection even though we're imperfect. Because if you set your sights higher by trying to be non-violent, and even though you will fail sometimes, you will finish up less violent because you have set your sights that much higher. And there's one other very, very important thought he has, that each individual person is different. There was a fascinating set of 7 letters that he wrote in 1926. They're not even in the 100 volumes of collected works. He praised a township which had decided to kill 60 dogs that might be rabid. They were stray dogs, they might well be rabid, they might pass rabies to each other and of course to humans. He praised this township for killing 60. His readers were outraged. They said, we thought you believed in non-violence. And you can see him through 7 letters having to think. He always published the objections of his opponents. That's a wonderful thing for a philosopher to do. He wasn't trying to protect himself. He was genuinely trying to look at the subject more deeply, to deepen his view, and not to conceal what had been said against him. That's a model of what philosophers should do. And as he deepened his ideas, he applied his thoughts about us all being individuals. So there is a universal rule, violence is always wrong, but, for example, if you have become a councillor on the council which runs a township, then you've taken on an extra duty. And because you've taken on that extra duty, that might override your still very strong duty not to be violent. Maybe simply because you took on this role, you undertook it voluntarily. Now you've got an overriding duty to practice violence against these dogs. That would be one case. And here's another case. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that the Ali brothers, the Muslims with whom he was then in communication, didn't agree with him about non-violence. They thought that retaliation was the manly thing, was the virtuous thing, was the right thing. All right, he said, they're completely wrong. Every time they're violent, they'll be doing wrong, but it would be even more wrong if they went against their own beliefs in order to please Gandhi. No, they shouldn't do that. While they've got this erroneous, sadly erroneous belief, they must act according to their own beliefs. So again, he's recommending non-violence, not because it's right, it's wrong. He's recommending violence, not because it's right, it's wrong. One more example. He talked about Hindu tradesmen on the Afghan frontier who were often attacked by raiding Afghan tribesmen. And they ran away naturally, so would I. I would run as fast as any of them. But he said, look, your character should learn something from Afghan fearlessness. You run away, well, I see why you run away, but you should learn something from the Afghans who are fearless. Next time, stay where you are and shoot them. Extraordinary from a man of non-violence, it seems. So many, many people say, he's inconsistent, he says whatever he feels like. No, it's because he believes that your individual character helps to decide what it's right for you to do. It's always wrong to be violent. Shooting back would be wrong. But it might be even more wrong to run away because he thought the tribesmen ought to learn some character traits from these very violent Afghans. So in every case, it's the individuality of the person here which helps to decide what it's right for you to do in a particular case, even though violence is always wrong. And that's something the Stoics would enormously agree with. It's not the only thing. There were 4 other comparisons I made with the Stoics on major issues, but individuality. How do you make important decisions in life? Always include the question, who are you? Who do you want to be as an individual? Because it's relevant to the decision you make, and it might override the fact, which is a fact for Gandhi, that violence is always wrong. Nonetheless, sometimes you should be violent. That's not inconsistent. It's the depth of his thought about how to make decisions with which the Stoics would very much agree. I shouldn't downplay the extent to which he also became interested in Indian sources. Of course he did. And that's why my book, while acknowledging that and telling what little I understand about that, needs to be complemented by Indians who know the Indian sources. I say as much about them as I possibly can without expertise. But any study of Gandhi has got to understand the Western sources, and it's interesting that it was Westerners who taught him first. Not only did they teach him about Plato, teach him about Tolstoy, they also taught him about the Bhagavad Gita when he went to London to study to become a barrister. The English Victorians who so liked him were appalled that he'd never read the Bhagavad Gita. They gave him the Bhagavad Gita in an English translation by an Englishman called Arnold. And they said, "You haven't read this? You must read it at once." Well, of course, he became devoted to the Bhagavad Gita too. It was one of the great influences on him. He gave lectures on the Bhagavad Gita. But he learnt it from English people. He paraphrased it in Gujarati, not its original language. And so his knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita was channeled through English sources, through a Gujarati understanding. And of course, as with everything he read, it didn't end up being what a scholar of the Bhagavad Gita would tell you, yes, 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 that's so true to what was originally meant. It wasn't like that. It ended up being something very Gandhian, uniquely Gandhian, and that is a mark of a great philosopher, to use a source, but to produce something original, and I'm saying that's equally true of the Bhagavad Gita, just as it's true of Plato, just as it's true of Tolstoy. It didn't take me longer than my other books. Now that I'm retired, I can write books faster. When I was full-time work, it used to take me 5 years to write a philosophy book. Now, in retirement, one of the pleasures is I can write a book in 3 years. I don't think this book took me very much longer than 3 years because to understand Gandhi, one has to understand both the Indian thought that influenced him and the Western thought. Now, I can't manage the Indian thought very well. I don't have the languages. I do consult people who have the languages, but obviously I'm not going to be an expert on the Indian side. But to understand Gandhi, you've got to be also an expert on the Western side. Let me give you an example of that. Gandhi said, that he thoroughly disliked Indian views on non-violence. He thought the Indian belief, he may have been wrong, he was not a historian, but he thought the Indian belief was, it's all right if you tread on a beetle, that's fine because I've done nothing wrong. All that would be wrong was if I tread on a beetle. There's no compassion for the beetle. He hated that. He said he was a devotee of violence until he read who? Until he read Tolstoy, who taught him that true non-violence is an attitude of mind. It's an ocean of compassion. Of course, as I've been saying, he didn't stop there. He developed his ideas further. But it's real compassion. It's compassion for the beetle. It's compassion for other humans. Only then did he become a devotee of non-violence, he says. So how interesting. Here's a case in which he actually rejects the Indian tradition, and I believe never went back to it, and learnt from a Westerner. He says, of course he actually went far beyond a Westerner. Tolstoy was influential in Russia, and he inspired an awful lot of people. But he didn't, like Gandhi, go beyond that. He didn't tell people, and what shall we do when they punish us? How shall we stand up to the punishment we'll receive? Are we all qualified to be non-violent, or should some of us do something different, like running schools, teaching Indian ideas instead of British ideas? There are many roles, constructive roles as he called them. We don't all have to take the risks of non-violent resistance. But if you do take the risks of non-violent resistance, you must learn how to emotionally detach yourself from the things we value, from comfort, from freedom, even from your life, I'm sorry to say, even from your loved ones, from sexuality, famously. You've got to learn to detach yourself. That's another thing on which he agreed enormously with the Stoics. And further, he said if you emotionally detach yourself, that gives you a kind of freedom. How could the Viceroy do anything by locking up Gandhi? He'd long ago detached himself from any feeling he must be allowed to be free. He detached himself, and that gave him a freedom. Who was frightened when the Viceroy put him in prison? The Viceroy was frightened. Gandhi wasn't frightened. He long ago had detached himself from the need to be free. That's exactly the kind of freedom the Stoics believed in. And he said, you must love all people. With his family, it was rather a distant and detached sort of love. Family men might not anywhere else recognize that as family love. It was exactly the same with the Stoics. They said you should love all human beings, foreigners, people of different faiths, races, love them all. But don't privilege your family, said the Stoics, exactly what Gandhi said. They were so like each other. And another example, both he and the Stoics believed that justice was owed to all human beings, but justice was based on duties, no rights, not human rights. He was very much against human rights. The Stoics did not speak of justice in human rights, justice for all people based on your duty, not on the rights you got. In all these ways, by chance, he came up with a view very like the Stoics.